Welcome to Biblical Theology Today. I want to do a quick video on an Ask It Basket question. This is a particularly good question, I thought. How do you know what symbolism like rivers, trees are connected and which ones are not? And I think the question here is related to the idea of limits in terms of artistic or literary interpretation. How do you know the limits? How do you know when you come to a text and you see an intertextual echo or a connection? How do you know that that's a valid connection? And I have thought about this question a long time over the course of a career of research, and this is a fundamental question. It's one that divides scholars. I think for me the answer is, well, is it the kind of connection that God sees? God is the ultimate author of Scripture, and so authorial intent, what you're looking for, the kind of observations that God would make if you sat down with God and talked about text. And some people say, oh, that's so arrogant. You think you can think God's thoughts after him. Well, in terms of the totality of God's thoughts, well, no, I'm sure that God has much greater thoughts than I will ever have, any of us will ever have. But I do think, and I come to the text, assuming that God is an effective communicator, and so if God is an effective communicator, then thinking his thoughts after him is kind of the goal of what God intended in the text. So when we come to the question and say, well, how do you know, like validity, what I think this is asking about is validity in interpretation. And there are kind of three passages that I would go to, and then a little bit of a principle. The first one, the passage that I like in my thinking to start off with, is the passage that Jesus gave us about interpreting. This is the Emmaus Road, and Jesus appears in a way where they don't recognize him at first. And he says, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Interesting, their eyes were strong, or krateod, in order not to recognize him. I'm not sure exactly what that means. I do have a friend who thinks that this whole text is perhaps mimicking in some ways the Adam and Eve story, the gender of the two travelers. One is given and one is not, so it's possible, but the idea of eyes being opened and eyes being closed. And so Jesus on the Emmaus Road is walking with him. They don't recognize him at first. And they were discussing, and Jesus, in masterful form, says, well, what were you talking about? And they stood still, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered, are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened? And he said to them, what things? Oh, that is so just wonderful. As a teacher, you're asking questions, you're trying to understand where they're coming from and trying to help people see their own presuppositions. And they kind of chide Jesus almost and say, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priest and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him, but we'd hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And interesting word there. We had hoped he was the one to buy back, to ransom Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things have happened. So they recognize that so many things in the scripture seem to be third day things, and they're saying, hey, it's the third day now. And then they say, moreover, some of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb. Of course, this agrees with the account in John of Peter and John running to the tomb. And then notice what Jesus says, "O foolish one, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had spoken." So Jesus comes to the Old Testament text, and he says the obvious meaning is that the Messiah will die and rise, and that all these things are connected with the Old Testament text. It seems that is a radically Christocentric approach, and a fairly straightforward hermeneutical approach. He's not saying, make sure that you are just committed to, grammatico-historical exegesis, and the meaning in the text is only what the original human author meant to the original human audience. He doesn't say that. He gives a statement, hey, the Old Testament is about Christ, and so Jesus knows what he's talking about in terms of Scripture, and he says, hey, this is how you should approach it. And Jesus says, was it not necessary that Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And then he says, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted them in all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. So validity and interpretation, does it agree with what Jesus is doing here and what he's saying here? And so many people come to this text and say, oh, we should nuance that. No, we shouldn't nuance it. We should follow what Jesus said exactly. And if Jesus takes a radically Christocentric approach, he is the ultimate teacher, and we should follow him as interpreters. A second passage that I love to point out and important in my own thinking is 1 Corinthians 10. And here, Paul is just warning the Corinthians not to do certain things. And he says, for I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses. So really interesting text, thinking of the Red Sea crossing and everything that goes with it is being baptized into Moses. All ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. This is a radically Christocentric approach to the Old Testament. And Paul observes, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, points out all the people who died. And then Paul says this, and this is his hermeneutical axiom. Now, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. So Paul is saying the reason that text is in Scripture is because God wanted to teach things to us as Christians. So how do we know that our interpretation is valid? Well, are we approaching it that way? Are we listening to Jesus the way he approached the Old Testament? Are we listening to Paul and the way he approached the Old Testament. And then a last passage, and then I want to talk about a more general principle, is in Philippians 1:20. And John Piper has a great sermon on this, but this statement that Christ will be megalunthestai, that Christ will be made mega, Christ will be made much of. And so for me, an interpretation is legitimacy about cleverness, or is it about making much of Christ? And so if a particular interpretation makes much of Christ, it seems like it's much more likely to be valid. When I go beyond that, and if I'm connecting something, say Jesus and the Passover, I like to ask the question, is it the kind of things that people have seen in the past? And so, you can go to Exodus 12, the Passover. And if you're making connections with Christ, well, what you can do is, once you've studied the passage on your own, do a brief history of interpretation on the passage, and with resources that we have in Logos, with this commentator's Bible, which I don't know if it's exactly the same as Mikroth Gedaloth. Use both of them. This seems to be the more recent English version of Mikroth Gedaloth, but it's a collection of kind of Jewish interpretation. Well, what do the Jewish heavyweight people see? And so we have access there. I do the same thing with the early church. I want to see, are the connections I'm seeing the same kinds of connections that people have seen in the past? And if I start running into people like Augustine and Ambrose and the Venerable Bede, connecting the passage, then I feel like I'm on the right track. We do have that same resource. I don't know if I have it here for the Reformed. Reformation Commentary on Scripture will show you what the Reformers thought. Over the years, I've come to trust people like John Gill, people like H.D.M. Spence. I also consult modern commentaries. I have to admit, I'm less impressed with modern commentators. They just often seem to have more commitment to higher critical principles, but I do check what they say. If I get really deep into a passage, I might go into the deeper Judaica to see what they've thought, start composing a history of tradition, trying to balance ancient, medieval, and modern. And if I come to the text and I see that there are people who are connecting text in a similar way, then I feel like that I'm making a valid point. I call it standing on my own 2 feet. And, at the end of the day, it's not a piece of paper from a university that says, hey, you're a good interpreter of Scripture. Ultimately, it's God. And so you look at people like Spurgeon, who never had any college degree that I'm aware of, and yet look at his commentary on this Psalms. He's anybody's rival. Gill, as a nonconformist, was excluded from higher education, and yet who is Gill's equal? I don't know anyone who's Gill's equal in terms of his familiarity with the text in the original languages. And so when we come to the question, how do you know what's a valid interpretation? I ask, well, to boil it down in terms of simple questions, if the Old Testament story is positive, how is it like Christ? If it's negative, how is it a contrast to Christ? Come to an Old Testament story, how is it connected to the Garden of Eden? And then ultimately, how is it connected to the eschatological consummation of New Jerusalem? Looking for Christ, looking for connecting the passages. It seems to me that Jesus made that point. Paul made that point. Certainly the early church made the point with people like Justin Martyr, Dialogue with Trypho, followed up by Augustine, Ambrose, Bede, doing a history of interpretation. And when you do that, and you find that many people are agreeing, then it's like, well, yeah, God intended that and intended for us to see it. So I do think this is a great question. In fact, I think it's one of the key hermeneutical questions when you come to the Bible. Where you come down on this question will depend a lot on where you're going to come down as a whole. So that's what I think. I'll be interested what you think in the comments. And as always, I look forward to talking to you again next time.